Never before in the history of the Catholic Church has the throne of Peter been so empty, not for lack of faith, but for absolute silence. No cardinals, no smoke, no names. What if, in a single instant, all the cardinals on earth died before a new pope was elected? What would happen to the Vatican? What would happen to apostolic succession? In this three-part series, you will discover the possible and impossible paths for the spiritual and institutional survival of the largest religion on the planet. Welcome to a reality where the Church finds itself facing the unthinkable, the death of God's electors. Since the first century, the Catholic Church has maintained an uninterrupted succession of leaders. From Peter to Francis, 266 pontiffs have occupied the throne of Rome. The election of the Pope is more than an administrative act. It is a symbol of spiritual continuity, of unity, and above all, of Christian identity. Throughout history, the world has witnessed popes elected at different times, of war, plague, persecution, and division, but never the total absence of cardinals. What if this were to happen today? Cardinals are the Pope's main advisors, and more importantly, the only ones with the authority to elect his successor. After the death of a pope, they gather in the Vatican in conclave, isolated in silence, in prayer, to discern the choice of the new pontiff. But what few people know is that without cardinals, the conclave is impossible. Without a conclave, there is no election. Without an election, there is no pope. And without a pope, the Catholic world enters into something very rare, an absolute vacancy. Imagine a coordinated attack, or a fulminating pandemic, or a devastating security failure during a large meeting of the College of Cardinals. If, in a single day, all the cardinals died or became unable to perform their role, the Vatican, already in mourning for the death of the previous pope, would plunge into a second emptiness, the absence of those who would vote for the new leader of the Church. St. Peter's Square would be silent. The chimney of the Sistine Chapel would never emit smoke. The entire Catholic world would be shocked. The Apostolic Constitution Universi Dominici Gregis, which governs papal elections, provides in detail how the conclave should proceed. But there is a problem. It does not provide for what to do if there are no living cardinals. What does church law say when there is no one left to carry it out? The official answer is nothing. This hypothesis was never written. It was never considered. It was never lived. But now it is reality. The Roman Curia, the administrative government of the Vatican, is made up of cardinals and their collaborators. Without their leaders, the departments would become orphans. Ecclesiastical authority would collapse. Bishops around the world would wait for guidance that would never come. The Church would be temporarily voiceless, faceless, without leadership. And the people of God, what would happen to the faith without its supreme shepherd? While the Vatican would try to maintain order, governments, journalists, analysts, and the faithful around the world would ask only one question: who will choose the new pope? If there is no one to vote, headlines would explode. Unprecedented crisis in the Vatican. Church plunges into chaos after disappearance of the College of Cardinals. End of apostolic succession. Millions of Catholics around. The world would react with pain, confusion, and anxiety. Some would demand immediate action. Others would call for calm, prayer, and reflection. Extremist groups might see this as an opportunity to declare false popes or claim authority. But the common people, those who pray in silence and believe in the mystery of faith, would wait for a sign from on high. With the College of Cardinals abolished, the only moral and spiritual authority left would be the bishops of the entire world. From the interior of Brazil to Nigeria, from the Philippines to Canada, thousands of bishops would gather in prayer. And then the unthinkable would begin to be considered. calling a universal council, an extraordinary meeting between the pastors of the church to decide the fate of the apostolic succession without cardinals. The Catholic Church has faced schisms, wars, persecutions, and even anti-popes, but it has never faced the absolute void of its highest leadership. The throne of Peter is empty, the cardinals are dead, time is running out, and the future of the succession is in the hands of those who still believe. St. Peter's Square is packed with the faithful, but the chimney of the Sistine Chapel remains silent. There is no smoke. There is no announcement. There is no habemus papam. The world waits. But this time it waits for a miracle, or for an unprecedented decision. With the College of Cardinals abolished, the Church enters a kind of symbolic paralysis. Masses continue, the sacraments are celebrated, prayers do not cease, but at the top there is a vacuum. Without a pope, the nuncios' apostolic offices have no one to answer to. Without cardinals, the congregations of the Curia have no leaderants, and for the first time in 2,000 years, there is no visible successor to Peter. While Rome remains silent, the episcopal world moves. Emergency meetings are called between episcopal conferences. Bishops from all over the world debate an idea that seemed forgotten in the history books: a new general council. Inspired by the councils of Nicaea, Trent, Vatican I and II, the new meeting would not be to discuss doctrines, but to save the structure of the Church. In Canon Law, only the Pope has the authority to call an ecumenical council, but now there is no Pope, and there are no more cardinals who can exercise papal power on an interim basis. The only remaining force is the Episcopal College, formed by all living bishops. It is then that something unprecedented happens. For the first time in history, the bishops decide to act in absolute collegiality. Communications are sent, calls are made. The convening of an extraordinary World Council becomes a reality. Thousands of bishops arrive in Rome. St. Peter's Square is once again the stage of hope. Instead of cardinals in their red capes, we now see a multitude of bishops, priests, deacons, and religious of all cultures, languages, and faces. They are not there to elect a pope directly. They are there to decide how the Church can elect a pope when the rules have been erased. At the sheer heart of the council, three proposals gain strength. Directly elect a bishop as pope by collegial vote. Justification. Peter was also a simple bishop when Christ called him. Appoint provisional cardinals who would then hold the conclave. Justification. Restore the college and maintain tradition with an institutional fresh start. Maintain the vacancy until a sign from heaven appoints a new leader. Justification. A time of purification, penance, and spiritual listening. Division is inevitable. Some bishops fear that any change will disrupt the unity of the Church. Others argue that the survival of the faith depends on adaptation. Theologians quote St. Irenaeus, "Where the Church is, there is the Spirit of God." But conservatives insist, without valid succession, we risk losing Peter. The council becomes a field of spiritual tension, but no one leaves the table, for everyone knows the world is watching. After weeks of debate, prayer, and listening, a decision begins to form. Inspired by the model of the early centuries of the Church, the bishops decide to choose from among themselves a group of 12 men representing the 5 continents. These 12 will form an extraordinary college with emergency authority to elect a new pope. They are not cardinals, but they are consecrated men in communion with the Catholic faith and recognized as pastors. In a historic act before the entire Church and broadcast globally, the 12 bishops gather in the Sistine Chapel. They do not enter as princes of the Church, they enter as servants. After 3 days of prayer and discernment, smoke finally rises. White smoke. Tears stream down the faces of the faithful. Habemus Papam. says the voice of the dean among the 12. The new pope appears on the balcony, a simple name, a face marked by time, and a fragile but firm voice. My brothers, I have not come as one who assumes the throne, but as one who washes feet. Pray for me, for the burden I receive. Today belongs to the entire church. The church survived, not because it followed rules, but because it followed the Spirit. And even in the face of the end of everything, God showed that he still walks among us. The succession of Peter had been restored, not by tradition, but by faith. The new pope was not a cardinal. He was not known internationally. He had no titles, no pomp. He was just a missionary bishop from the interior of Africa. His name was Dom Elias. He was chosen not because of political influence, but because of his life dedicated to the poor, the sick, and the forgotten. His election was celebrated as a miracle. But it also generated doubts and divisions. The day after the announcement, newspapers around the world carried surprising headlines. Pope without cardinals, revolution, or rupture. The succession of Peter has survived, but is it wounded? The last pope of the prophecy? Will Dom Elias be accepted by the whole church? While millions celebrated the election, other voices were raised with skepticism. Who elected him? By what authority? Was this choice valid? In countries such as Germany, the United States, and parts of Italy, ultra-conservative groups began to organize against the new pontiff. They accused the council of violating canon law. They called the pope illegitimate, and they threatened to break communion with Rome. On the other side, progressive movements said that the church had finally been purified of clericalism. Tensions. While millions celebrated the election, other voices were raised with skepticism. Who elected him? By what authority? Was this choice valid? In countries such as Germany, the United States, and parts of Italy, ultra-conservative groups began to organize against the new pontiff. They accused the council of violating canon law. They called the pope illegitimate, and they threatened to break communion with Rome. On the other side, progressive movements said that the church had finally been purified of clericalism. Tensions were growing, and with them, the risk of what the church fears most, schism. In his first homily as pope, Archbishop Elias did not defend his election. He spoke about the cross. I was not chosen to be king. I have been called to suffer with Christ for the pains of humanity. If my election serves unity, accept me. If it does not, do not look at me. Look at Jesus. He is the true shepherd. His words touched millions, but they did not convince everyone. In Ireland in the 12th century, a monk named Malachi wrote a prophecy with the symbolic names of 112 popes. The last on the list was called Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. According to the prophecy, after him would come the final judgment. Theologians and mystics from all over the world began to ask themselves, will Dom Elias be the last pope in history? Coincidentally or not, Dom Elias had been born in a small village called Petra and was enthroned in Rome as a servant of Peter. The prophecy was reopened, and with it, the fear and fascination of the end. Over the months, Dom Elias began a pontificate marked by radical simplicity, decentralization of power, proximity to the peripheries, revaluation of the sacraments, and a profound Marian spirituality. But his opponents called him fragile. They said he was the result of a forced election, of a rupture disguised as a miracle. The Vatican was no longer the same. The world was no longer the same. Was the Church reinventing itself or breaking apart? On the evening of June 29th, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, Pope Dom Elias gathered a crowd in St. Peter's Square. He asked each person to light a candle. Today, we celebrate the rock on which Christ built the church, but the rock that supports it is not visible. It is the faith of each heart. The Vatican, which had lived in emptiness, now shone like never before. In his last public letter, Dom Elias wrote, "The world will ask if my election was valid. I ask, was it filled with the Holy Spirit? History will judge my courage or my error. But I know that, between chaos and tradition, the Spirit breathed. And where there is breath, there is life." Dom Elias lived only 7 years as Pope. After his death, the Episcopal College met again. This time, the election was made in a less dramatic way, but equally guided by faith. And so, the apostolic succession continued. Malachi's prophecy lost its breath, but the Spirit kept the breath of the Church. Maybe he was not the last Pope. Maybe he was just the first of a new era. The Church is made of stone, but also of blood, of tradition, and of resurrection. Even when the world believed it was the end, God showed that it was still only the beginning.